So let's get started from the top and ask the most obvious question. How do psychologists define creativity?
Well, I think the most fundamental element of creativity is actually conceptualized as a biological trait. So people have different personalities, and we all know that, although our terminology for describing those personalities is broad and somewhat difficult to categorize. But psychologists have made a lot of progress on that over the last, particularly in the last 40 years, really from a strictly scientific perspective. And we know that people differ in extroversion, and extroverted people are gregarious and enthusiastic and assertive. And so they seem to wend their way through the world by utilizing social capital and social networks. Extroverts don't necessarily like you, but they like to be around you.
And are creative people extroverts?
No, creative people are slightly tilted towards extroversion, but that's not the fundamental dimension.
Okay.
Introverted people like to spend time alone, and there's plenty of creative introverted people. That another personality dimension is known as neuroticism, somewhat unflatteringly, and it's an index of sensitivity to negative emotion, so that if you know people who are volatile, they're touchy and they tend to fly off the handle, or they're sad or morose or anxious or tend to avoid stressful situations, then they tend to be higher in trait neuroticism, and that's specifically a negative emotion dimension. Extroversion is an index of positive emotion. And so there are separate biological systems, positive and negative emotion.
I'm trying to get us back to creativity.
Yep. Well, the third category is agreeableness. Agreeable people are compassionate, and they basically live for close, intimate, personal relationships. There's conscientious people who are dutiful, and then there are open people. And the open people, the dimension is called openness to experience. They're people who are fundamentally interested in ideas. So if you're talking to an open person, they will immediately move the conversation to the discussion of ideas. So most of the people in the audience tonight, for those who aren't here for political curiosity, are here because they're open people. They want to hear an intellectual discussion, and so open people are interested in ideas. That's the intellect component of openness, and then they're also interested in aesthetics, and that would be where the artists really. Intellect and aesthetics is where the artists come out. And the thing that's important to know about that, and it's why I went through all 5 traits, is that these are attributes and ways of looking at the world, ways of behaving that are fundamentally rooted in biology. They're very, very deep. It's not a surface trait by any stretch of the imagination. And creative people also tend to be higher in trait intelligence, technically speaking. And that's the ability to manipulate abstractions rapidly.
So is creativity a sort of second level then? Because the traits that you've just described don't include them. Where are they in that group?
Well, creativity loads very highly with openness. Creativity and openness are probably synonymous, more or less. Although it isn't obvious that interest in ideas per se is the same as creativity, but there's very few people who are artistic who aren't very interested in ideas. So they move along the same path very tightly.
So let's unpack this notion, because it's axiomatic that creativity and art are indistinguishable. Is that true from the point of view of a psychologist?
I would say it's a pretty decent truth. It's open people are the ones that are interested in aesthetics. So there are lots of people who are, in some sense, blind to beauty. It's actually one of the things that distinguishes, strangely enough, it distinguishes conservatives and liberals, roughly speaking, because liberal people tend to be high in openness. They tend to be creative, but they're low in trait conscientiousness, so they're not very dutiful. They're not particularly orderly. They're not particularly industrious, not compared to conservatives.
Liberals?
Yes. Well, it's partly because, you see, this is one of the paradoxes. Conservatives are high in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they're low in openness. And I think the reason for that in part is that it's not that easy to be creative if you're too industrious or orderly. Because imagine you want to be a musician and you're 18, 19 years old, or worse, 25 years old, Well, the thing is that it's an insane thing to do if you're someone who's dutiful and career-oriented and practical, because the probability that you're going to monetize your creativity is so low that it's futile to even attempt it in many situations. And so if you're too concerned with convention and productivity, then that's going to undercut your ability to manifest adherence to your creative vision, which also takes you in all sorts of directions, none of which are necessarily practical. So one of the ways of thinking about creativity is that it's a gambling strategy, and conservatives make low risk, low return, but certain bets, really. And whereas the more liberal types and the more creative types, they make high risk, high return bets. And so almost all of them fail. But those who succeed dramatically, and they also change the world. And so, although it's very foolish to be creative, it's creative people who lead the vanguard forward into the unknown and transform the world. So, foolish as it is, it's absolutely necessary.
Foolish because risky?
Yes, because risky, yes. I mean, it's foolish in the same way that a high risk, high return bet is foolish. There's a high probability that you'll lose. And so if you're a conservative person, you're very concerned about hedging your bets. You don't want to lose. Being creative is a very bad game to play, but you won't play it anyways because you're conservative, so it isn't going to matter.
So you are an open late teen, and you have conservative parents, and you say, Mom, Dad, I think I've decided that I'm going to be an artist.
Oh yeah, and they think, what's wrong with that kid?
That's a complicated conversation, isn't it?
Yes. It's like discussing color with someone who's colorblind. And I mean that. And it's actually a perverse thing about conservatives in some sense, because the data on the economic utility of artists is really, really strong. I mean, artists and entrepreneurs are the same people. And of course, entrepreneurs are the people who provide all of the vision for the entire capitalist system. They're absolutely necessary. But conservatives tend to be so blind to art that they can't even see that the artists are the people who drive the economy forward.
But you make them sound so bad.
No, look, I mean, so here's another way of thinking about it. Is liberals,
are we talking about political conservatives and political liberals?
Yes, we're also talking about personality traits determine voting patterns to a great degree. So people vote their temperaments. And this is something that's really useful to understand when you're engaged in a political discussion, is that the person across the table from you who holds viewpoints other than yours is not doing it because they're stupid or ill-informed. They're doing it because they are not the same sort of person you are. And the funny thing about creative people versus conservative people, say, or liberal people versus conservative people, is that liberals start companies and conservatives run them. So, and I seriously mean that.
I'm glad to know you need conservatives.
Yeah.
I was getting a little bit worried.
They're managers, like conscientious people make good managers and good administrators. And they tend to do better in school too, because diligence and dutifulness is an excellent predictor of academic performance. So if you want something that's already been invented, implemented, and then turned into a machine, you don't get someone creative to do that. They're off to do the next thing. They're not even interested in that. You'll bore them to death. So.
Wow. So let's say you're an employer and you need some creative people.
Yep.
Is there a psychometric test to find out if someone's actually creative and they're going to be useful?
Well, IQ tests work. I mean, not everyone with a high IQ is creative. Lots of lawyers have high IQs and they tend not to be creative at all. Well, you think about why that is, because lawyers are bound by precedent and rules, and so that isn't the same as being creative. And you want a creative accountant? No, not really. not unless you're looking for a jail sentence. So
they don't like that word at all.
No, yeah, that's right. My creative accountant, wink, right. So, I mean, I psychometrically tested the 100 most creative lawyers in Canada as a project about 15 years ago with a magazine called L'Expert, which was a high prestige magazine among lawyers. And we had lawyers from across the country be nominated by their firms for creativity. And so we got some really, these were outstanding lawyers. So, and we tested them psychometrically, very, very high in intelligence, but not creative at all. The first trait was conscientious, dutiful, hardworking, diligent, industrious, orderly. Because you're working 70 hours a week, and you better bloody well work if you're in a position like that too. So it's nose to the grindstone stuff. Very low in neuroticism because it's very stressful. So they didn't experience much negative emotion. Very disagreeable people. Well, they're litigators, and so they want to win. They're not compassionate and they're not polite. And only after that were they open. So they weren't creative at all, but they were extraordinarily intelligent. So.
Do employers look for creative people?
No, not generally. Well, it's a real conundrum. So one of the things that's happening right now is that in most businesses, the non-creative people are increasingly being replaced by machines, right? Because anything that's creative can't really be turned into an algorithm that you can run as a machine, but anything that isn't creative can be. And so there's increasing demand in corporations for creative people, but the problem with being creative is that you're useless at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Because at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, so a power hierarchy, you should do what you're told to do. You're not there to think outside the box. You're there to learn what you're supposed to do and implement it. And creative people are like, that isn't what they do. Now, what happens though to companies is that because they filter all the creative people out at the bottom, and then people start to rise up to the top, you really need creative people at the top because they are the entrepreneurial types, and they're the ones, for example, in law firms, even though lawyers aren't very creative, the more entrepreneurial ones are the ones that bring in all the business. There's like great lawyers who can implement, who can write well and communicate well, they're not a dime a dozen, but they're relatively common. But the ones who are entrepreneurial, who can go out there and drum up new business, man, those people are super, hyper valuable, and they're very rare. But it's also very difficult to nurse them within any system, because systems do not nurture creativity. They're the antithesis of creativity. Because the artist is always the person who stands outside the structure. And so, or maybe builds his or her own structure, which is also why it's hard to evaluate creative people. You can't, really, because if they're operating within the confines of a system that has an evaluative structure, they're not creative. So they're a real pain to try to manage and to organize. But you can select them. You select people who are high in intelligence and high in openness. We've done that in California. So I work with this company called the Founder Institute. It's quite a cool company. It's run by this guy named Hideo Resi, and he has now started schools to foster entrepreneurship in 135 different cities. And so we're testing in 8 languages, and we can reliably select people who will have a functioning business within a year. You select them for high openness and high intelligence, roughly speaking. So it's certainly something you can do. But then you have to figure out what you're going to do with those people, because telling them what to do isn't going to work, and putting them in a box is completely counterproductive. So they're very annoying, even though they're hyper necessary.
We work with living artists, and I spent my whole career working with living artists. I worked with one dead artist once, and I will never do that again. But it's not for the faint of heart. It's not for everyone to manage creatives.
It's also not for everyone to be one. I've only known one person in my life that attempted to live, I would say, fully as an artist outside of systems. And I mean, he was a jack of all trades. He could do everything. He was a licensed electrician. He was a carpenter. He was a taxi driver. He could pilot boats. He was great at fixing up houses. He was a designer. He was a good speaker. He was a good problem solver. He chased all the rats out of the McGill campus at one point. That was one of his jobs.
Does he speak French?
He does. He does.
Give him my card.
Yeah, well, and he's also a very accomplished artist, and he was the best at that and great at social networking, But even him, he had to be dancing all the time to monetize his capabilities. With that multi-dimensional array of skills. So it's very hard to be an artist and to survive over any reasonable period of time.
What's wrong with our social structure? Well, first of all, are creative people common? Are there a lot of them? Is this a problem we need to solve to find a way to integrate them and to I don't want to say exploit them, but exploit their creativity for the greater good? We don't seem to be very good at that. We've marginalized them. There's no minimum wage for visual artists, for example.
No, we do an abysmal job of it.
Can we fix this, our communities?
Well, the correlation between grades and creativity in university, at the University of Toronto, for example, is 0, right? But that's because it's not that easy to grade people who are creative. But so educational institutions do a great job, especially before the university level, of just crushing creative people. So, because the education system was actually set up back in the late 1900s to train the children of workers to be obedient workers. I mean, you think all the desks are lined up in a row. You're supposed to sit down. You're supposed to shut up. You're supposed to do what you're told. You do things by the bell. That's a factory bell that rings for recess and so forth. They're factories. You don't produce creative people in factories. You produce factory workers, and that's fine, except there aren't any factory workers anymore, so we should probably stop doing it.
I'm not sure things have changed.
They haven't changed at all.
Things haven't changed very much.
No, and it's hard. You were asking about the commonality of creativity too, and the other thing that's difficult and horrible is that creative people are as rare as the winners of races. No matter how many people who are racing, there's only one winner. Yeah, well, and everything tends to go to the winner, and that's how things work in the world. And the thing about being creative is that it isn't that you have to be creative, it's that you have to be more creative than everyone else. And good luck with that, especially in an era where creativity is distributed unbelievably widely on platforms like the internet. Now, I read the other day, and I probably got this figure wrong, but the orders of magnitude are approximately correct. 80 million songs are available for download online. 70 million of them get downloaded 0 times, right? And that's typical of creative production, right? I mean, the number of symphonies that most of you people have written is 0, right? The number of books you've published is 0. The number of books you will publish is 0. If you publish a book, the probability that it will sell more than 100,000 copies is 0, right? The rejection rate for a good scientific paper is 99%. So it's very, very difficult to be creative because you have to get there first. And then even if you do get there, very few people take all of the rewards. You think about Stephen King, for example, right? He's a really good example. It's like half the money in the publishing business goes to Stephen King. And the reason, well, here's why. You know, think about where people buy books, novels. It's in airports often. And so then you imagine that the geographical territory for the distribution of novels is something like the book rack in front of the bookstores in an airport bookstore, right? So it's this rack that's this big. Number 1 position, that's worth God only knows how much. Number 2 position is worth half that. Number 3 position is worth half that. And by the time you get down to number 50 position, well, you're not doing anywhere near as well as number 1, but you're doing way better than all the other people who are getting 0. And that piece of geographic real estate is replicated at every airport all over the world. And so that number 1 slot, man, that's where all the money goes. It's like the 1% of the people who have 50% of the money, and the 1% of them that have 50% of that money, and the 1% of them that have 50% of that money. The winner takes all, and that's particularly true in a creative domain. The winner takes all. And most people stack up at 0. It's really rough.
So creative people are getting a really rough, they're not getting a break at all. And there are probably more creative people doing non-creative work in the workforce than the other way around.
Oh, definitely. And you know, the thing is, I don't want to paint too dismal a picture about being creative, because one of the things that pays off big for creative people is that they get to be creative, right? There's great aesthetic joy in that, and depth. And I've been privileged because I've worked with more creative people than would fall to the lot, let's say, of the typical psychotherapist, because people often come and see me because they've watched my videos online, and they deal with people who are interested in those subjects tend to be creative. And one of the things I've really been struck by, first of all, I've learned that, for those of you who are interested in such things, that the reason Jungian psychology works is because it works for creative people. It doesn't work at all for non-creative people. It just falls dead and flat for them. They're not interested in it at all. It isn't how they think.
You mean as therapy?
Yeah, it doesn't match their personalities. Whereas creative people, man, they dream archetypal dreams all the time. It's really interesting. And also, they die if they're not being creative. They wither on the vine. I had one client, I really liked him. He was a brilliant architect. And his rational mind was his worst enemy because it just criticized everything. He was hyper-rational, criticized everything, and really in a dark way, and effectively, you know. If I could get him to not think and just create, he was a complete genius. He could. That's where all of the vitality in his life was. You know, that's where the sap rose up inside the dead tree that was sort of embedded inside of him. And it's very common with creative people is that it's their lifeblood, and it really is from a biological perspective. This isn't some epiphenomena. It's built right into people and deeply.
Well, this is something that those of us who work in art museums and work with living artists and contemporary art, and if I have any contemporary curators in the audience, they'll know what I'm talking about. This is a drama that we live on a regular basis. The number 1 is barely affordable, but you're working with people who are absolutely brilliant. But there's no way for them to monetize their brilliance. They're productive, they're making wonderful art, the experts love it, the market's not interested, and they're having a hard time. You can't support them by buying everything they make. You're a public institution, you're building a collection that's going to be useful for the future, so you can't put all your money on the poor ones, but the poor ones are every bit as brilliant as the really, really successful ones from our objective point of view. So this is a problem that I have. And we produce these people in our art schools. We've got very good art schools in Canada. So there's a population of artists who are coming out of our art schools who, as a society, we cannot support. We can only support a very tiny fraction. So for me, the solution is we need creative people in other professions. Can they be consultants to help other professions be successful?
Well, if if you're a business and you're facing problems that you don't know how to solve, it's creative people that you want to consult with, because they will think laterally. I mean, you asked about the psychometric definition of creativity earlier. I mean, imagine that people, it's a very complicated concept to get across properly, but if you think about musical genres, you can imagine that there are people who work very well within a tight musical genre. Okay, they're creative, but only creative within the confines of that genre. But there are multiple genres. If you're super creative, you would be able to be creative across multiple genres, right? And so what that means is that you can always step outside the box you're in and think outside of it. And that's what creative people do. And so if you're trapped in your box, your company is going down the drain, for example, because your product is no longer useful. You need someone who can come in and think laterally, which is what entrepreneurs do. I mean, one of the hallmarks of an entrepreneurial thinker, it's sort of entered the jargon of the venture capitalist sphere, for example, is that an entrepreneur has to be able to pivot. So let's say you're an entrepreneur, you want to bring an idea to market. And you have your idea, it's well developed. You go out in the market and you find there's no market for that idea, which is what's going to happen to all your creative ideas, by the way, because matching them with the market is exceptionally difficult, because you have to be there at the right time and in the right place. You have to be brilliant, you have to come up with a product that's not easy, then people have to want it, and they have to want it now. And often that means if you're first to market, you're dead, because you can't even advertise your damn product because there's no lexicon for it. How do you sell something to people that they don't even know exists? So that's the first person in a brand new field dies for sure. You need 10 people out there advertising it before anybody can be successful. But the entrepreneurs, in their early stage, they have to pivot. And what that means is that if their first idea doesn't work because it doesn't fit the market, for example, they have to be able to generate another one on the fly. And creative people, that's what they do. They're problem solvers. And if you want creative problem solvers, then you hire creative people. Now, if you hired artists, you would get creative people insofar as the art schools are able to select creative people. And there's self-selection, so they select creative people and posers. Well,
let's talk about the posers. How can an art collector, let's say, who doesn't trust dealers and really is only interested in their own eye, and they go around and they're looking at all the various galleries and they're building their own collection, which is unusual, by the way, because they do rely a lot on the dealers. They never ask my opinion, but anyway, how do you know the difference between a poser, someone who's just merely clever, and someone who's authentically creative and is original and is moving the story forward, if you don't have very much experience in the game? By the way, I'm an expert in that.
It's easy. You just wait 200 years. You just wait until 200 years after they're dead. Yeah. Yes. And then skim off the top. Yeah.
We actually think of ourselves, those who work in art museums and spending public money on exhibitions and collections, we talk amongst ourselves, and we're very careful about winnowing through the people who are also rands, posers, or who are not actually going to be the ones who are going to make that flag that will remind everyone of 2017 versus the ones who are.
Well, when you're trying
what's the real art history of Canada? Is it with these artists or that one?
When you're trying to do that, I mean, okay, so first of all, we'll assume that you're a creative person, and I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. And then we'll also assume that you're very well educated in the history of art. So you're in a good position because you can tell when something's been done before.
Right.
And you also know the difference between something that's been done well and something that hasn't. So in order to do the selection process properly, then you'd have to be creative. You have to have the intelligence and the temperament for it, and that's the capability of perceiving it.
So you're saying I'm creative?
Well, it's highly probable, because otherwise the probability that you'd be in this position and interested in it, you actually like art.
I do.
Well, there you go. So I mean, if you don't like art, you're probably not creative. And if you genuinely like it, and then it isn't even liking, it's like you can't live without it. And that's a whole different thing. And it's very difficult for people who aren't like that to understand it. And But if you are like that, then art speaks to you, and it speaks this language of tremendous beauty and continual revelation. And you can educate yourself, obviously. You do that by, I would say, mostly studying philosophy, literature, all the artistic domains, the humanities. Make yourself a connoisseur and ally that with your temperament, and then you have a reasonable chance at selecting things that at least aren't duplicates of what's been happening before.
Right. What I normally tell people is get your own information and work hard. Study hard if this is going to be a serious hobby of yours and you're going to be investing a lot of money in it. Get your own information.
Right. Well, and people are people are absolutely terrified of art. They're absolutely terrified of it. I know. Which is why Canadians' favorite decorating color is beige. It's like, really? It's like, don't paint your wall red because you'll never be able to resell your house. It's like everybody accepts that as a truth. It's like, people can paint walls. It's a rather foolish piece, but people are terrified that they'll make an aesthetically displeasing choice and that everyone will laugh at them, and so they stick with beige. And they really are frightened of art, and no wonder they should be. So
now, why should they be frightened of art?
Because it speaks of the ultimate depths. If it's real art, it brings it into your house, man. People come. I've got like 600 paintings in my house. Every square inch of the house is covered with paintings, and it's quite a shock for people when they come in. Well, it's because some of them are of Lenin, so surprisingly enough.
I've been in your house, Jordan, and a lot of them are of Lenin.
Yes. Well, I collected a bunch of Soviet realist art because I have interest in totalitarianism. But anyways, my walls are completely covered with art.
And not as a nostalgia. It's not a nostalgia.
No, it's not a nostalgia thing, no. It might be a prophetic thing, though.
Oh, dear. Well, let's not go down that road. I want to talk about being a parent. And you don't know whether you have a creative child or not. What is the wrong way to be a parent if you have a creative child and you don't know it? And what's the right way? I mean, you're a parent.
Well, here's a good thing to do if you want to have a creative genius as an adult child. Die before they're 10. That helps a lot. So there's quite an extensive list. So if you're inclined to do that, suicide would really do it because.
Now explain that, please.
Yeah, well, there's a famous psychologist named Hans Eysenck who was the most highly cited psychologist in the world for a long time, and for all I know still may be. He wrote a great book called Genius, which is a real study of creativity. It's the real thing, and so people just hate it because it's not full of platitudes that will make you feel good. He says to be truly creative you have to have a near genius level IQ, and that sort of puts you in the 1 in 1,000 range, so that's kind of annoying to begin with. That might be me.
I don't know.
And so, but he's also found that early traumatic experiences are good predictors of late creativity. Now, we should also say that early traumatic experiences are also great predictors of catastrophic adult lives. So, but you can imagine the thing that people don't understand about creativity, or one of them, is that there's no reason to be creative unless you have a problem to solve. And if someone dies on you young and you're forced to fend your way in the world and to deal with that kind of trauma, you have to put yourself together in a creative manner, and it's no joke. And so early negative experiences allied with high intelligence and this kind of temperament that we were talking about is one of the things that fosters creative production. And parents are misinformed about this sort of thing because they think that if they just do laissez-faire things with their children, you can do anything you want, they'll automatically be creative. It's like that's the stupidest thing you could possibly imagine, because that isn't how creativity works. Creativity emerges when you put serious constraints on things. And so a good example of that, like a symbolic example, is the example of the genie. And the word genie is at the root of the word genius, so they're nicely tied together. And a genie is this tremendous godlike force encapsulated in this tiny little space. And in order for the genie to be able to grant wishes, it has to be both constrained extraordinarily tightly and be without constraint at the same time. It's the conjunction of those two things. And so in order to have someone be creative, you have to set them a difficult problem. You know, great literary figures, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, people like that, Shakespeare, man, they're solving tough problems. And someone like Picasso, he invented an entirely new way to see. It's like, try that.
Well,
That's what visual artists are
Brock
doing.
did, but he worked very closely with Grok.
Well,
anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to be
enough.
a nerd here, but
fair enough.
so let's go back to this trauma thing. What if you are your personality traits point to conservative 10-year-old, and your parent dies? What happens to you? Do you automatically become creative, or
no,
are you out of luck?
You just spiral into the abyss, and there's no. No, I would say that what a conservative child would
Does
do
that
under
make
those-
you creative?
No,
or
it's
either
very
you are or
unlikely.
you're not. Is that
Very
what you-
unlikely. I mean, a lot of these things are more biologically determined than people like to admit. And so, I mean, what? If you're introverted, try turning yourself into an extrovert. See how well that works. It's good luck. Like if you have a really introverted child, you can make that child socially skilled and able to tolerate interactions with groups, but the probability that you'll make that child like it is so low. Because introverts, for example, get exhausted by social contact. So those of you in the audience, you think, well, you go to a party, do you have more energy afterwards or less? If the answer is, well, far less, I need to go sit in a dark room with an ice pack on my head, then, then you're more introverted. And it's very difficult to move that. You can, but it's very hard. And creativity is the same way. You can crush it. You can crush it.
Crush creativity.
Oh, sure, that's easy. And we do that all the time. And you're usually pretty happy about it, too. So,
Well, give us an
fostering it is
example of
hard.
how to crush creativity so we don't
Quit
do it.
daydreaming.
Oh my God, yes, I
Yeah,
remember
that's
that
the same thing as saying quit being creative. That's the same thing. Quit
Yeah.
daydreaming. It's like, quit using your imagination. That'll really
You're bringing
work.
back bad memories now, Jordan.
Yeah, well, schools do that all the time. Stop daydreaming and pay attention to your work. It's like, well, what if my work is daydreaming? Well, then we're going to punish you because you're going to be a good worker in a factory. Oh, yeah, those disappeared 100 years ago. I guess we haven't noticed yet. Oh, well, too bad for us. And our children, right, and our future for that matter, because it's unbelievably boneheaded. But, once a system gets established, it tends to persist. And so, well, that's how it is, but it's pretty sad.
So where are the creative people in our society? We know that they're artists. So
They're starving in garrets.
Yeah, well, or are they working at McDonald's?
No, how about Bill Gates? He did all right. Steve Jobs, he did all right.
No, but I mean, what are the professions
they're at the pinnacle
where people
or-
get to be creative in their jobs? Because we've got this professional deformation that makes us think
Yeah.
that only artists are creative and everybody else is just watching.
Well, the entrepreneurs for sure. So people who start companies, they're the same people. They're the same people as artists. And they're more gadget oriented usually, but the temperamental predictors are exactly the same. And so I would say you find artists, creative people overrepresented among people who you might regard as failures over their life course, and radically overrepresented among people that you would regard as spectacularly successful. And that's the high risk, high return gambling strategy essentially. So
We've eliminated lawyers and accountants.
Bankers, you can throw them out too.
Bankers are gone.
Any managerial and administrative position is generally very low creative.
Wow.
Writers, artists, movie makers, literary people. I wouldn't say professors. We did a study a while back predicting what graduate student attributes predicted scientific success. Creativity was negatively correlated. Well, it's because, again, science is actually an algorithmic machine, right? That's why it's so powerful, is that you can get people who aren't creative but who will work hard, and they crank the levers, and out comes knowledge. And it's an extraordinarily powerful technology. But you can't get creative things published. You can get incrementally better things published. Creative things is like no one has any idea what to do with them. And the non-creative people will think, no, that's rubbish. It's like they don't know any better, but it's very, very hard to evaluate.
Are you creative?
See my socks?
Yeah, no. That wasn't you, that was Van Gogh.
Yeah, but I picked them out. Actually, my wife picked them out. But I'll wear them. Yes, I'm creative.
I wanted to ask you, and I think we have a bit of time left, I wanted to get in a little bit deeper. some of the controversies that we have lived through in the past here at the National Gallery, let's talk about Voice of Fire, for example. And one of the arguments was, well, there's no skill involved, where's the creativity? And that's, from my point of view, it's very easy to answer. Following what you've just said, Barnett Newman, who was a lousy painter, wasn't even interested in painting, was actually one of the most important artists of the 20th century, gave himself these constraints. He really, really restricted his field of operation to vertical stripes, and with a sort of metaphorical connection to humanity and our vertical aspirations. Can we talk about creativity when we're getting into an area of extreme constraint on the part of an artist, a minimalist who paints, let's just say, someone like, there's a very famous Polish artist whose name escapes me right now, but somebody's going to yell that out, who counted for his entire life and then took a picture of himself every 10 years and just counted until the color ran out, and then he starts over with another color. And his name is not coming to me.
Okay.
But so, if you're looking at this objectively, conceptually, it's really quite powerful and unique. And these paintings, there's one at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and we will always regret not having one here at the National Gallery. We're not likely to have one. He died. And they're quite sought after. Can you still talk about creativity when someone has a great idea in 1964 and then just proceeds to produce that idea and replicate the same thing for the rest of their lives? I'm getting into the deep psychoanalysis of creativity.
Okay, well, there's a couple of things I would say about that. The first is that people were upset about that painting because they think that art is decoration. They thought, well, that's not decoration, or they think that I'd be able to do that, which they wouldn't, by the way, because it's a lot harder than it sounds or than it looks. But art is not decoration. That's absolutely foolish. Art is exploration. And artists train people to see. Like, when most of you would, I presume, would regard Impressionist art as both self-evidently beautiful and also as relatively traditional, because of course you all now see like Impressionists see, all of you that are even vaguely part of the 20th century. You can't help it because the Impressionist aesthetic saturated everything, saturated advertisements, saturated movies, saturated everything. You now see like an Impressionist. They taught you to see, but back when the Impressionists first showed up, there were riots when their art was hung because the idea of perceiving that way was so radical that it caused people to have emotional fits. And so artists teach people to see, and I mean that literally. It's very hard to perceive the world. And so, and who was the artist that made all the squares with red and yellow and white?
Oh, Pete Mondrian.
Mondrian, he's a great example. I mean, if you go downtown Toronto now, there are Mondrian buildings everywhere. And so he was playing very, very carefully and intensely with these arrays of geometric shapes, and that's not well, I like it, but it's not particularly decorative, and it's certainly not naturalistic or realistic. It's like, what's this crazy guy up to with all his squares? It's like, well, everything is built out of squares. So he's thinking, well, what are the interesting things we can do with squares so they shimmer and glow, and so that we get the geometric harmony proper, and it's just invaded architecture. You can see Mondrian absolutely everywhere. And so these people, so here's a way of thinking about artistic and creative people from a biological perspective. So imagine that the world is basically an explored territory inside an unexplored territory. Every world is like that. Everywhere you go is like that. There's things you know and there's things you don't know. And the conservative people like to be in the middle of the things that are known. And they can master that space, and they're good at maintaining it. But the artists like to be right out on the edge, and that's the edge between chaos and order. And they like to expand the domain of order out into the chaos. And they do that first by transforming perception. And you can see very concrete examples of this if you think about what creative people do in cities. They always do it, the same thing. So they're starving to death, and this is partly why, but they go in a city and they look at some ratty area that's sort of quasi-criminal and that's seen better days, and they go there and they think, with a little work, this could be cool. And so then they rush in there and they build some galleries and show some art, and they civilize it a bit, and then a coffee shop pops up, and the next thing you know, the yuppies move in because they're sort of creative but also kind of conservative, so they're the next ones into the frontier, and then the developers show up and they kick all the artists out. But that's okay, because then artists go off and rejuvenate some other area. And that's what artists do, is that they're transforming chaos into order all the time. That's where they live. They live on that edge. And so it's a very tough place to live, because you can fall into the chaos at any time.
This is kind of blowing my mind, actually, because I just wrote recently in the commemorative book for the 150th here at the Gallery that science helps us understand the world, whereas artists create a world that we can understand. It's just they're sort of opposite. It amounts to the same, but they're opposite approaches.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and you just said that.
Artists have always been on the frontier of human understanding. You know, the artist bears the same relationship to society that the dream bears to mental life. Like when you're dreaming at night, you're actually pretty creative when you're dreaming, and that's why when you remember a dream, you think, oh man, like where did that come from? Which is pretty weird, that something can happen in your head and you have no idea how it got there or what it means. That's a bloody miracle. You know, every night that happens. It's like, I had a dream. Where did it come from? What does it mean that you had it? How can you not understand it? How can you produce something like that? It's like a whole movie that you don't even understand. You produce it. You don't produce it, you experience it. The dream is the thing that mediates between order and chaos. It starts to make chaos into order. So it's half chaos. That's why it's not comprehensible. And artists play exactly the same role in society. They're the visionaries that start to transform what we don't understand into at least what we can start to see. And they've always been that. They've always been at the vanguard. That's their biological niche.
So they're creating confidence for the community.
They're the civilizing agents. I mean, look at Europe. Think about, and this is one of the things that really bothers me about the fact that conservative people have a hard time properly valuing art economically. It's so paradoxical, because conservatives are very concerned about economics. It's like, okay, fine, then why don't you fund the damn artists? Because you look, Europe is so beautiful that it's just heartbreaking when you go there. I mean, I've been to like medieval villages in Germany, for example. It just made me cry when I saw them. They're so damn beautiful. And the beauty that the Europeans have produced is infinitely valuable. People go from all over the world on pilgrimages to Europe just to look at beautiful things. It nourishes their soul. They're priceless. Paris is priceless. Rome is priceless. And it's all beauty that drives it. It's phenomenally valuable. And Canada is just ugly as sin, man. Really.
Okay.
Really, we should be ashamed of ourselves.
You are not going to get an argument from me on that subject.
Yeah.
What's wrong with us? I come from my family. There were some creative people. My father was an actor. My mother was not. She was very utilitarian. Why are we as a society so utilitarian? Because we really are. Are we still in survival mode because it's so cold? I don't understand that, because we actually produce probably more brilliant artists per capita than a lot of other countries in the world. I would say most, in fact. What's wrong with our cities?
It's a really, really complicated question. I mean, I've really asked myself that in Toronto, because I mean, I like Toronto, but like art from an aesthetic perspective, it's like, not good. Not good at all. It's getting better. I mean, there's some creative buildings coming up in Toronto, and so some of it is, I think, a function of population size. You know, you need a pretty wicked population center before you start getting a lot of creative occurrences happening. But there's an intrinsic middle-of-the-roadness that characterizes Canadian society that makes it nice, I suppose, which is a very low-end virtue in my estimation. It's like, what's my moral virtue? I'm fundamentally harmless. Jesus, you'd think you could do better than that. So I had an experience with that at the University of Toronto that I'll tell you about, because I think it's extraordinarily comical, and then I'll tell you a little story about how I figured it out. I spent a bunch of time with this artist I told you about, trying to transform my cinder block hellhole, fluorescent lit factory catastrophe of an office into something that someone with some sense could sit in for 30 years without dying. And so I got this artist to act as a consultant.
Does your employer know your feelings about this?
Yes, definitely, yes. They know my feelings about a lot of things, actually. So I brought this artist in, and I loved consulting with him, because he liked to do really spectacular things for no money, which is a lovely set of constraints.
Very
And so
creative.
We were going to cover the cinder block walls with cherry plywood, good one side, and then buff it and varnish it so it'd have a wood paneled office. And then he was going to paint the drop ceilings. Jesus, hell is a place of drop ceilings and fluorescent lights. And so he was going to paint them with this paint called Hammerite that looks like beaten steel when it dries. Yeah. And so we had these really cool ideas, and I had a budget of like $1,200, so we were going to completely transform the office for $1,200. And I talked to the former chair of the psychology department about this, who I had some discussions with about transforming the psychology department from this, like, my creative brother-in-law, who designed the chip in the iPhone, by the way, he called the architecture hosable. And what he meant by was that anything of any sort could happen in that building and you could just hose it down and it would be okay. It's like, God. So my former chair was sort of sensitive to this sort of thing, so we had a bit of a talk about maybe doing some transformations, and I thought that this person was on board. But then when I asked, I was sharing this excitedly, and this person said, well, you can't do that. And I shook my head and I thought, okay, I'm going to make something ugly, better, fast, with no trouble, for no money. And your response is, you can't do that. And I thought, okay, well, I said, well, why not? And the person said, because everyone would want it. And I thought two things. A, we're in kindergarten, and B, I'm talking to someone insane. So then I changed my conversational tack quite substantially. And I had to default to plan B, which made my office very colorful. It's got like drop kind of copper ceiling, and it's full of paintings, and people come in and they're, it's a place of beauty and creativity, and not a bloody, horrible, fluorescent lit factory. And I had to fight for that a lot. It was weird. And then I found out afterwards that for a while the department would bring new potential hires into my office to show them the office, to show them what was possible at the University of Toronto. So I thought that was so comical. But anyways, I do have a point of this story, because I thought about that for a long time. I thought, God, people are afraid of what I'm doing in this office. Well, and for good reason, I guess. But I thought there's something to this that I don't understand. There's really something to this. So then I came across this story by Robert Sapolsky. I think it was Robert Sapolsky. And he was talking about zebras. And so I'll take 2 minutes and tell you the zebra story, because if you understand this story, you understand absolutely everything about human beings. And so it's worth 2 minutes. So zebras hypothetically are camouflaged, right? That's what everyone says, but come on, really? Lions are camouflaged. They're the same color as the grass. Zebras are black and white. You can see one of those things like a mile away. But there isn't a zebra. There's a herd of zebras. And so the zebra is actually camouflaged against the herd. Now that's something to think about. So the stripes of zebras are the zebra's jargon. That's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, no kidding. So anyways, biologists go out and study zebras, and zebra biologists, and they got to watch a zebra to figure out what it's up to. And so they watch a zebra, and then they make a note, and then they look up and they think, oh my God, like which collection of black and white stripes was that zebra? Because the stripes don't outline the zebra, and they camouflage the zebra perfectly against the herd. So if you look away from the zebra down and back up, you don't know what you're looking at. So the biologists think, oh crap, we better solve this problem. So they drive up to the herd with a Jeep and a bucket of red paint and a stick with a rag on the end of it, and they paint one of the zebra's haunches with a red spot, or they clip its ear like you do with cattle. Then you can keep track of the zebra. Guess what happens to the zebra? The lions eat it.
Oh.
Right. Oh is right. Bloody right. Oh, yeah. The lions cannot hunt a single zebra down unless they can identify it, because they organize their hunt. They have to organize their hunt around and identify.
You can't hunt 4 zebras. You can only hunt one at a time.
You can't hunt a blur of zebras.
No.
And so the reason they go after the little ones, or the ones that limp, isn't because they're part of kind nature and just culling the weak. That they like a nice, healthy, delicious, juicy zebra as much as the next person. But they have to be able to identify. So the thing is you make yourself colorful. You stand out. The lions will kill you.
Aha.
Right. Well, Canadians We don't like to stand out. We like everybody to do okay. But we don't like it very much when people stand out. And so, I mean, I'm not being entirely critical of that. I really do understand it. I really do understand it.
Because there's lions out there, you guys.
There are. That's right. There definitely are. And if you stick your neck out, then the lions will come. Or the sword, because that's a common saying, right? The head that sticks up above the rest is the first to be cut off by the sword. Many, many cultures have a saying like that. The poppy that grows higher than the rest is the first.
The tall poppy syndrome.
Exactly, exactly. And so, and it's exactly right. It's biologically correct. Now, why Canadians are particularly prone to that, I don't know if we are particularly prone to it, but we certainly have hideous cities, and we should be embarrassed about it because we have the wealth to make them beautiful, and the return on that investment would be absolutely unparalleled. So, and it's something that, if people understood the relationship properly between creativity and economics, then we wouldn't have to have an ideological discussion about creativity, right? Because
we'd have a practical one.
We'd have a practical one. It's like, well, I don't think much of artists, says the lawyer, but they generate a lot of income, and I'm pretty happy about money. It's like, okay, maybe we can have a discussion. And
on that note, Jordan, I wanted to thank you so much for. I'm going to go to bed much less of an idiot tonight, as we say in French. Thank you for enlightening us on the psychology of creativity and about creativity, and I would invite everyone to go out and make more beauty in our city.
yes.